From his own party, as we mentioned, voted to defeat the president's signature campaign issue, as the president was today handed a major political blow, with the U.S. Senate voting to block his self-declared national emergency to fund the border wall. A dozen Republican senators defected. They crossed over, voted in favor of the resolution. But in this case, a yes vote meant no to his emergency declaration. Those 12 included both Republican senators from Utah. It's the first time Congress has ever voted to block a presidential emergency declaration, and it likely means another first for President Trump. Earlier today, he said, quote, "I look forward to vetoing the just-passed Democrat-inspired resolution, which would open borders while increasing crime, drugs, and trafficking in our..."
The recent congressional vote to terminate the National Emergency Declaration represents a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle between legislative and executive authority in American governance. What initially appeared to be a routine procedural matter quickly escalated into a constitutional confrontation that has exposed deep fractures within the Republican Party itself. The bipartisan coalition that formed to challenge this particular exercise of presidential power signals something far more significant than a single policy disagreement. It indicates a growing institutional resistance to the expansion of executive authority that has characterized recent administrations. When members of a president's own party join the opposition to block an emergency declaration, the political calculation has clearly shifted from partisan loyalty to institutional preservation. The constitutional mechanism at play here deserves careful examination, as Congress has historically been reluctant to invoke its powers to check presidential actions even when legally justified. The National Emergencies Act provides Congress with the authority to terminate emergency declarations through joint resolutions, yet this power has rarely been exercised with such decisive bipartisan support. What makes this situation particularly noteworthy is the context in which these emergency powers were invoked. Border wall funding represented not a sudden crisis requiring immediate unilateral action, but rather a policy priority that had failed to secure legislative approval through normal appropriations processes. The distinction between genuine emergencies and policy disputes masquerading as emergencies lies at the heart of this constitutional tension. The Republican defections that enabled this vote to succeed reveal the complex calculations facing legislators in an era of heightened institutional stress. These lawmakers faced pressure from multiple directions: their party leadership demanding loyalty to the administration, their constitutional oath requiring fidelity to separation of powers principles, and their constituents expressing varied opinions on both the specific policy and the broader question of executive overreach.
This is Pete Williams. Federal law gives the president wide latitude to declare a national emergency, even for something that's not really a crisis. It's what he wants to do with that authority that will bring the legal fights. There has to be a close fit between the nature of the emergency and the powers the president invokes to deal with it. The ACLU says tonight it will sue, claiming President Trump cannot use the Pentagon's money for a non-military purpose, given that U.S. troops are not allowed to conduct civilian law enforcement like Border Patrol. But some legal experts say when Congress voted this week to provide some money for the border wall, it will undercut another potential claim that he's spending money for something Congress doesn't want.
The president will be able to say in response, well, that's not quite true. Congress did, in fact, authorize me to build a barrier. They just didn't give me all the money I need to do it.
The legal battles will last at least a year and probably wind up in the Supreme Court with a decision during the 2020 campaign. Pete Williams, NBC.
The decision to break ranks suggests that for some members, the long-term health of institutional constraints on presidential power ultimately outweighed short-term partisan considerations. This pattern of Republican resistance to executive actions has been building across multiple policy areas, from trade authority to military interventions, suggesting a potential realignment in how the party conceptualizes the proper scope of presidential authority. The legal challenges accompanying these legislative actions create a multi-front pressure campaign against the administration's expansive interpretation of executive power. Courts have increasingly been asked to adjudicate the boundaries of presidential authority, with mixed results that often depend on the specific statutory language at issue. The combination of legislative termination, judicial review, and potential funding restrictions represents a comprehensive strategy to constrain executive actions that bypass congressional approval. This institutional response reflects a recognition that emergency powers, while necessary for genuine crises, can become normalized as tools of governance in ways that fundamentally alter the constitutional balance. The implications of this confrontation extend far beyond the specific policy dispute over border wall construction. The precedent being established or resisted will shape how future presidents approach emergency declarations and unilateral executive actions across all policy domains. If Congress successfully terminates this emergency and sustains that position through potential veto override attempts or subsequent negotiations, future administrations will face stronger incentives to work within legislative processes rather than around them. Conversely, if the administration prevails in maintaining its emergency declaration, despite congressional opposition, the practical constraints on executive power will be significantly loosened for all future presidents regardless of party affiliation. The institutional stakes here involve more than abstract constitutional theory. They directly impact how American democracy functions in practice. The framers designed a system of separated powers with overlapping authority specifically to prevent the concentration of power in any single branch and to ensure that major policy decisions reflect deliberation rather than unilateral will. When emergency powers are invoked to circumvent normal legislative processes for long-standing policy priorities, that deliberative function is compromised. The congressional response in this instance represents an attempt to restore that deliberative function and reassert the legislature's constitutional role in determining how public funds are allocated. The political dynamics surrounding this vote illustrate the tension between party loyalty and institutional responsibility that characterizes modern congressional politics. Lawmakers must navigate between the immediate demands of party discipline and the longer-term interests of the institution in which they serve. The decision to support terminating the emergency declaration, knowing it would provoke a presidential veto and potential political backlash, demonstrates that for at least some members, institutional considerations prevailed. This calculation likely involved assessments of constituent preferences, re-election prospects, and genuine constitutional convictions in varying proportions for different legislators. The broader pattern of executive-congressional conflict during this administration has accelerated the use of constitutional tools that had fallen into disuse or been employed only symbolically. War powers resolutions, funding restrictions, and emergency termination votes have become standard features of legislative strategy rather than exceptional measures of last resort. This normalization of institutional conflict, while potentially destabilizing in the short term, may ultimately strengthen constitutional constraints by demonstrating that these mechanisms can be effectively deployed. The practical demonstration that Congress can and will push back against executive overreach establishes expectations that may constrain future presidential behavior even when specific votes do not occur. The economic and practical implications of the emergency declaration and its termination extend to questions of military construction funding and the reallocation of resources appropriated for other purposes. The administration's plan to redirect funds from military construction projects to border wall construction raised questions about the statutory interpretation of emergency powers and the relationship between declared emergencies and available funding sources. The congressional termination vote directly challenges this funding reallocation strategy and seeks to preserve the original legislative intent behind military construction appropriations. This aspect of the dispute highlights how executive actions can have cascading effects across multiple policy areas and budget categories. The international dimensions of this domestic constitutional dispute deserve attention as well, as allies and adversaries alike observe how the American system processes internal conflicts over authority. The stability and predictability of American governance has historically been a source of diplomatic strength, while periods of institutional conflict can create uncertainty about policy continuity and commitment. The specific policy at issue, border security and immigration, also has direct international implications that affect diplomatic relationships with neighboring countries and broader international cooperation on migration management. How the United States resolves this internal dispute may influence perceptions of American institutional resilience abroad. The media coverage and public discourse surrounding this congressional action have focused heavily on the partisan dynamics and immediate political implications, sometimes obscuring the deeper constitutional questions at stake. The narrative of Republican defections and presidential vetoes captures attention more readily than technical discussions of statutory interpretation and separation of powers doctrine. Yet the public understanding of these institutional conflicts shapes the political environment in which they are resolved, and the framing of these disputes can influence whether they are perceived as normal political disagreements or fundamental constitutional challenges. The coverage of this vote as a historic rebuke rather than routine opposition reflects the perceived magnitude of the institutional breach. The historical context for this confrontation includes previous presidential uses of emergency powers and congressional responses, providing a comparative framework for assessing the current dispute. Emergency declarations have been used by presidents of both parties for various purposes, with varying degrees of controversy and congressional resistance. The current situation differs in the combination of factors present: the specific statutory authority being invoked, the nature of the policy being pursued through emergency powers, and the bipartisan coalition opposing the action. Understanding this historical pattern helps assess whether the current confrontation represents a continuation of existing trends or a departure from previous practices. The administrative and implementation challenges associated with the emergency declaration and its potential termination create practical uncertainties that affect multiple stakeholders. Contractors, military personnel, and local communities face questions about project continuity, funding availability, and legal authority that depend on the resolution of this dispute. These practical uncertainties illustrate how constitutional conflicts between branches have real-world consequences beyond the abstract allocation of authority. The administrative state must operate within the constraints created by these political and legal disputes, often requiring difficult judgments about how to proceed when authority is contested. The role of the judiciary in resolving these disputes remains uncertain, as courts have historically been reluctant to intervene in conflicts between the political branches when possible. The political question doctrine and related justiciability concerns may limit judicial involvement in some aspects of this dispute, while statutory interpretation questions may provide avenues for judicial resolution of specific legal issues. The interaction between legislative action and judicial review creates multiple potential paths for resolving the current impasse, with different paths having different implications for future precedents and institutional relationships. The constitutional text and structure provide the framework within which these disputes are resolved, but the specific meaning and application of constitutional provisions remain subject to interpretation and political contestation. The vesting of executive power, the appropriations clause, and the necessary and proper clause all bear on the questions raised by emergency declarations and congressional responses. The interpretation of these provisions has evolved over time, and the current dispute contributes to that evolutionary process by testing the boundaries of accepted practice and establishing new precedents for future reference. The statutory framework governing emergency powers provides specific procedures for declaration, maintenance, and termination that structure the current dispute in particular ways. The National Emergencies Act's provision for congressional termination through joint resolution creates a streamlined process for legislative response that bypasses some of the procedural obstacles that often impede congressional action. The existence of this specific statutory mechanism suggests that Congress anticipated the need to check emergency declarations and provided itself with tools to do so, tools that are now being employed with unusual bipartisan support. The political economy of emergency declarations reveals incentives that may encourage their expanded use beyond genuine crisis situations. The ability to bypass normal legislative processes and access alternative funding sources creates temptations for presidents facing legislative opposition to their priorities. The availability of these mechanisms for policy implementation rather than crisis response represents a form of institutional drift that gradually transforms emergency powers into ordinary governance tools. The congressional response in this case may represent an attempt to arrest this drift and restore the distinction between emergency and non-emergency governance. The federalism implications of national emergency declarations and border wall construction involve state and local governments in ways that complicate the federal constitutional dispute. State attorneys general have participated in legal challenges to the emergency declaration, and local governments have been affected by construction activities and related policy changes. The multi-level governance structure of the American system means that federal constitutional conflicts often involve state and local actors with their own interests and legal standing, creating a more complex institutional environment than a simple two-branch confrontation would suggest. The democratic theory underlying separation of powers assumes that diffusion of authority protects liberty by requiring consensus across multiple institutions for major policy changes. The emergency declaration mechanism, while necessary for genuine crises, potentially undermines this diffusion confusion by allowing unilateral action in situations where deliberation and consensus would otherwise be required. The congressional termination vote represents an attempt to restore the normal operation of this democratic safeguard and prevent the erosion of deliberative requirements through emergency exceptions. The temporal dimensions of this dispute involve questions about the duration of emergency declarations and the circumstances under which they should be terminated. Emergency powers are conceptually temporary measures responsive to temporary conditions, yet some emergency declarations have remained in effect for years or decades beyond their original triggering events. The termination vote in this case raises questions about whether the underlying conditions justify continued emergency status and whether indefinite emergency declarations distort the constitutional balance over time. The fiscal implications of emergency declarations extend beyond the specific funding reallocations at issue to broader questions about budgetary process and congressional control over spending. The power of the purse is traditionally considered Congress's most potent tool for influencing policy, and executive actions that redirect appropriated funds potentially undermine this constitutional foundation. The congressional response reflects concern about preserving this fundamental aspect of legislative authority and preventing the erosion of appropriations control through emergency mechanisms. The strategic considerations facing the administration in responding to the congressional termination vote involve calculations about veto usage, political messaging, and potential compromise. A veto would continue the confrontation and force further congressional action, while acceptance of the termination would represent a significant retreat from the administration's position. The choice between these paths depends on assessments of political costs and benefits, institutional priorities, and the perceived importance of the underlying policy goal. The administration's response will shape not only the immediate outcome, but also the precedents and expectations for future similar disputes. The legislative strategy employed by opponents of the emergency declaration involved coalition building across party lines and careful attention to procedural requirements for termination votes. The successful mobilization of sufficient Republican support to pass the termination resolution required persuasion, pressure, and the cultivation of shared institutional concerns. This coalition building process illustrates the potential for cross-party cooperation on institutional maintenance even in periods of intense partisan polarization, suggesting that some constitutional values transcend immediate policy disagreements. The public opinion context for this dispute includes varying levels of support for the border wall, for the emergency declaration specifically, and for the general principle of executive congressional balance. These different levels of public sentiment create complex political environments for legislators deciding how to vote on termination resolutions. The relationship between public opinion and institutional action is mediated by party identification, media consumption, and issue salience, making straightforward majoritarian calculations difficult to apply to constitutional disputes. The professional and expert communities that study and participate in national security governance have been divided in their assessments of this emergency declaration and the appropriate response. Some experts have emphasized the genuine security concerns at the border that might justify extraordinary measures, while others have questioned whether the specific conditions meet the threshold for emergency action and whether the statutory framework is being appropriately applied. These expert disagreements reflect genuine uncertainty about how to balance security needs against constitutional constraints in complex policy environments. The international law and comparative constitutional dimensions of this dispute provide additional context for understanding American practices. Other democratic systems have developed various mechanisms for handling emergencies and maintaining constitutional constraints, offering potential models and cautionary tales for American institutional development. The American system's specific combination of presidential power and congressional checks differs from parliamentary and other systems, making direct comparisons difficult, but still informative for understanding the range of possible institutional arrangements. The technological and practical feasibility of border wall construction relates to the underlying policy dispute in ways that affect the constitutional controversy. Questions about whether the proposed construction is technically achievable, cost-effective, and likely to achieve stated security goals influence assessments of whether emergency action is warranted and appropriate. These practical considerations intersect with constitutional questions when determining whether the emergency declaration represents a good faith response to crisis conditions or an attempt to circumvent normal processes for disputed policy priorities. The historical evolution of presidential power and congressional response provides a long-term perspective on the current dispute that suggests cyclical patterns of expansion and contraction. Periods of expanded executive authority have often been followed by congressional reassertion and institutional reform, suggesting that the current confrontation may be part of a larger historical rhythm rather than a definitive transformation. Understanding these cyclical patterns helps avoid both excessive optimism about immediate constraints and excessive pessimism about long-term institutional erosion. The specific statutory authorities invoked by the emergency declaration and the legal challenges to their application involve technical questions of statutory interpretation that have significant constitutional implications. The administration's reliance on particular provisions of military construction and other statutes has been challenged on grounds of statutory text, legislative history, and constitutional avoidance principles. These technical legal disputes carry weight because they determine the practical scope of available emergency authorities and the effectiveness of potential congressional responses. The institutional memory and precedents created by this confrontation will influence how future presidents and Congresses approach similar situations, regardless of the immediate outcome. The demonstration that bipartisan coalitions can form to check emergency declarations, or the demonstration that such coalitions are insufficient to overcome presidential resistance, will shape strategic calculations in future administrations. These precedents operate through the shared understanding of what is politically and institutionally possible, affecting behavior even when no formal legal rules are established. The ethical dimensions of emergency power usage involve questions about the moral responsibilities of office holders and the moral limits of political action in pursuit of policy goals. The invocation of emergency powers for contested policy priorities raises questions about truthfulness in characterizing situations as emergencies, about respect for institutional constraints designed to protect liberty, and about the relationship between ends and means in political life. These ethical considerations influence how participants and observers assess the legitimacy of actions taken in this dispute. The communication strategies employed by various actors in this controversy reveal assumptions about public understanding of constitutional processes and the persuadability of different audiences. The framing of the emergency declaration as necessary security action versus executive overreach, and the characterization of congressional opposition as principled institutionalism versus partisan obstruction represent competing narratives designed to shape public interpretation of events. These communication strategies affect the political environment in which institutional decisions are made and implemented. The economic interests affected by border wall construction and emergency declarations include construction contractors, landowners, local businesses, and various industries with stakes in immigration policy and border management. These economic interests create constituencies for and against the emergency declaration that influence political calculations beyond abstract constitutional principles. The intersection of economic interest and constitutional dispute illustrates how institutional conflicts are embedded in broader social and economic contexts rather than isolated to governmental processes. The security professional community has been divided in assessments of whether the border situation constitutes an emergency requiring extraordinary measures, and whether wall construction represents an effective security response. These professional assessments bear on the constitutional controversy because they affect whether the emergency declaration appears to be a good faith security judgment or a pretext for bypassing legislative opposition. The credibility of emergency determinations depends partly on their alignment with professional security assessments, creating a bridge between substantive policy debate and institutional legitimacy. The administrative law dimensions of emergency declarations involve rulemaking, permitting, and implementation processes that create additional venues for legal challenge and political contestation. The environmental and other regulatory requirements applicable to border construction provide mechanisms for opponents to delay or prevent implementation, regardless of the constitutional validity of the emergency declaration itself. These administrative law channels represent alternative paths for constraining executive action that operate alongside direct constitutional challenges. The philosophical foundations of emergency governance in democratic theory involve tensions between the need for decisive action in crises and the need for deliberation and consent in normal governance. The concept of emergency as an exception to normal rules creates definitional challenges about what constitutes genuine emergency and how long exceptional conditions can persist before becoming normalized. The current dispute contributes to the ongoing philosophical debate about how democratic systems can maintain their character while responding effectively to genuine threats and crises. The conclusion to be drawn from this comprehensive analysis is that the congressional termination vote represents a significant moment in the ongoing evolution of American constitutional practice, but one whose ultimate significance depends on subsequent developments and longer-term patterns. The immediate confrontation over this specific emergency declaration is part of a larger struggle to define the boundaries of executive power and the effectiveness of legislative constraints in the contemporary American system. Whether this particular episode is remembered as a turning point or a footnote will depend on whether it establishes durable precedents for institutional resistance to executive overreach or proves to be an isolated exception in a broader trend toward expanded presidential authority. The health of American constitutional democracy requires that such moments of institutional confrontation be resolved in ways that preserve the capacity for deliberative governance and prevent the normalization of emergency exceptions as ordinary political tools.